Hello friends, welcome to Premier UPSC IAS. So continuing with the part 3 of the economies revision series for prelims examinations. Today we are going to cover from evolution of industrial policy in India. Introduction. Looking at the pros and cons of the available options, India decided that the industrial sector should be the prime moving force, PMF of the economy, the logical choice for faster growth. The secondary sector will lead the economy was well decided in 1930s itself by the dominant political forces among the freedom fighters. The industrial policies which the governments announced from time to time basically molded the very nature and structure of the economy. Thus, for a better understanding of the Indian economy, it is advisable to look into the various industrial policies. Industrial Policy Resolution 1948. This was not only the first industrial policy statement of India, but it decided the model of the economic system, that is, the mixed economy too. Thus, it was the first economic policy of the country also. The major highlights of the policy are given below. 1. India will be a mixed economy. 2. Some of the important industries were put under the central list, such as coal, power, railways, civil aviation, arms and ammunition, defense, etc. Some other industries, usually of medium category, were put under a state list, such as paper, medicines, textiles, cycles, rickshaws, two-wheelers, etc. Rest of the industries not covered by either the central or the state lists were left open for private sector investment, with many of them having the provision of compulsory licensing. 5. Review of the policy after 10 years. Industrial Policy Resolution 1956. The government was encouraged by the impact of the industrial policy of 1948, and it was only after 8 years that the new and more crystallized policies were announced for the Indian industries. The new industrial policy of 1956 had the following major provisions. 1. Reservation of industries. A clear-cut classification of the industries, also known as the reservation of industries, was affected with 3 schedules. Schedule A. This schedule has 17 industrial areas in which the center was given complete monopoly. The industries set up under this provision were known as Central Public Sector Undertakings, later getting the popularity as PSUs, that is, Public Sector Undertakings. They included also those industrial units which were taken over by the government between 1960 to 1980 under the nationalization drives. These industries belonged to Schedules B and C other than Schedule A. Schedule B. There were 12 industrial areas put under this schedule in which the state governments were supposed to take up the initiatives with a more expansive follow-up by the private sector. This schedule also carried the provisions of the compulsory licensing. It should be noted here that neither the state nor the private sector had monopolies in these industries, unlike Schedule A, which provided a monopoly to the center. Schedule C. All industrial areas left out of Schedules A and B were put under this, in which the private enterprises had the provisions to set up the industries. Many of them had the provisions of licensing and have necessarily to fit into the framework of the social and economic policy of the state. They were subject to control and regulation in terms of Industries Development and Regulation (IDR) Act and other relevant legislations. 2. Provision of licensing. One of the most important developments of independent India, the provision of compulsory licensing for industries, was cemented in this policy. All the Schedule B industries and a number of Schedule C industries came under this provision. This provision led to the establishment of the so-called license quota permit regime in the economy. Expansion of the public sector. It was pledged for the accelerated industrialization and growth in the economy. The emphasis was on heavy industries. 4. Regional disparity. To tackle the widening regional disparity, the policy committed to set up the upcoming PSUs in the comparatively backward and underdeveloped regions areas in the economy. 5. Emphasis on small industries. Emphasis committed on small industries as well as the khadi and village industries. Agriculture sector. Agriculture sector was pledged as a priority sector. Importance of policy of 1956. This is considered as the most important industrial policy of India by the experts. It was this industrial policy of 1956 in which the then PM Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru had termed the PSUs as the temples of modern India, symbolically pointing to their importance. There was a time soon after independence when the PSUs were regarded as the principal instrument for raising savings and growth in the economy. The rapid expansion of the PSUs accounted for more than half of the GDP of the economy by 1988 to 89. It decided not only the industrial expansion but structured the very nature and scope of the economy till 1991 with minor modifications. All the industrial policies were nothing but minor modifications in it, except the new industrial policy of 1991. Industrial policy of 1991 affected deeper and structural changes in it, with which India started a wider process of economic reforms. Industrial Policy Statement 1969. This was basically a licensing policy which aimed at solving the shortcomings of the licensing policy started by the industrial policy of 1956. The experts and the industrialists complained that the industrial licensing policy was serving just the opposite purpose for which India it was mooted. Inspired by the socialist ideals and nationalistic feelings, the licensing policy had the following reasons. 1. Exploitation of resources for the development of all. 2. Priority of resource exploitation for the industries. 3. Price control of the goods produced by the licensed industries. 4. Checking the concentration of economic power. 5. Channelizing investment into the desired direction according to planning process. In practice, the licensing policy was not serving the above given purpose properly. A number of committees were set up by the government to look into the matter and suggest remedies. The Committees for Industrial Licensing Policy Review not only pointed out several shortcomings of the policy but also accepted the useful role of industrial licensing. Monopolistic and Restrictive Trade Practices MRTP Act of 1969. It was announced in the new industrial licensing policy of 1969 to make major changes in the area of licensing and regulation. Purpose of the act was to regulate the commercial and trading practices of the firms and checking monopoly and concentration of economic power. Union government made it mandatory for the firms with assets of rupees 25 crores or more. They were put under obligation to seek government's permission, greenfield venture before any expansion and acquisition of other firms as per the MRTP Acts. Such firms were termed as the MRTP companies. Later, the upper limit known as the MRTP limit was revised upward to rupees 50 crore in 1980 and rupees 100 crore in 1985. For the redressal of the prohibited and restricted practices of trade, the government did set up an MRTP commission. Industrial Policy Statement 1973. The Industrial Policy Statement 1973. The Industrial Policy Statement 1973. The Industrial Policy Statement of 1973 introduced some new thinking into the economy, with major ones being as follows. A new classificatory term, that is, core industries, were created. The six industries of fundamental importance were put in this category, such as iron and steel, coal, crude oil, cement, oil refining, and electricity. In the future, these industries were also known as basic industries, infrastructure industries in the country. Out of the six core industries defined by the policy, the private sector may apply for licenses for the industries which were not a part of Schedule A of the Industrial Policy 1956. The private firms eligible to apply for such licenses were supposed to have their total assets of rupees 20 crores or more. Some industries were put under the reserved list in which only the small or medium industries could be set up. The concept of joint sector was developed, which allowed partnership among the center, state, and the private sector while setting up some industries. The governments had the discretionary power to exit such ventures in the future. Here, the government wanted to promote the private sector with state support. The government of India had been facing the foreign exchange crunch during that time. To regulate foreign exchange, the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act (FERA) was passed in 1973. Experts have called the FERA Act as a draconian act, which hampered the growth and modernization of the Indian industries. Limited permission of foreign investment was given, with the multinational corporations being allowed to set up their subsidiaries in the country. Industrial Policy Statement 1977. The Industrial Policy Statement of 1977 was chalked out of by a different political setup from the past with a different political fervor. The dominant voice in the government was having an inclination towards Gandhian socialist views towards the economy. The elements of this policy were the following: foreign investment in unnecessary areas was prohibited. It was an un it was an opposite stand to the 1973 policy, which promoted foreign investment via technology transfer in the areas of lack of capital or technology. In practice, there was a complete denial to let inflow of foreign investment. Two, emphasis on the village industries with a redefinition of the small and cottage industries. 3. Decentralized industrialization was given attention to the objective of linking masses to the process of industrialization. The district industries centers, DICs, were set to promote the expansion of the small and cottage industries at a mass scale. 4. Democratic decentralization got emphasis and khadi and village industries were restructured. Serious attention was given on the level of production and the prices of the essential commodities of everyday use. Industrial Policies Resolution 1980. In the year 1980, the new government revised the Industrial Policy of 1977, with few exceptions in the Industrial Policy Resolution 1980. The major initiatives of the policy were as given below. Foreign investment via the technology transfer route was allowed again, similar to the provisions of the Industrial Policy of 1973. The MRTP limit was revised upward to rupees 50 crore to promote the setting of bigger companies. The district industries centers were continued with. Industrial licensing was simplified. Overall, liberal attitude followed towards the expansion of private industries. Industrial Policy Resolution 1985 and 1986. Both were very much similar in nature, and the latter tried to promote the initiative of the former. The main highlights of the policies are the following. Foreign investment was further simplified with more industrial areas being open for their entries. The dominant method of foreign investment remained as in the past, that is, technology transfer, but now the equity holding of the MNCs in the Indian subsidiaries could be up to 49%, with the Indian partner holding the rest of the 51% shares. The MRTP limit was revised upward to rupees 100 crore to promote the idea of bigger companies. The provision of industrial licensing was simplified. Compulsory licensing now remained for 64 industries only. High level attention on the sunrise industries such as telecommunication, computerization, and electronics. Modernization and the profitability aspects of the public sector undertakings were emphasized. Industries based on imported raw materials got a boost. Import substitution. 7. Under the overall regime of the FERA, some relaxations concerning the use of foreign exchange were permitted. It was done so that the essential technology could be assimilated into Indian industries and international standard could be achieved. The agriculture sector was attended with a new scientific approach, with many technology missions being launched by the government. Evaluation of the policies till 1990. Side by side sorting out the historical hurdles to industrial expansion perpetuated by the past industrial policies, these new industrial policy resolutions were basically a preparation for the globalized future world. These industrial provisions were attempted at liberalizing the economy without any slogan of economic reforms. The government of the time had the mood and willingness of going for the kind of economic reforms which India pursued post 1991, but it lacked the required political support. New Industrial Policy of 1991. The new industrial policy announced by the government on July 23, 1991, had initiated a bigger process of economic reforms in the country. It was seriously motivated towards the structural readjustment that naturally obliged to fulfill the IMF conditionalities. With the policy, the government kick-started the very process of reform in the economy. That is why the policy is taken more as a process than a policy. The major highlights of the policy are as follows. De-reservation of the industries which were reserved for the central government by the IPR 1956 were cut down to only eight. In coming years, many other industries were also opened for private sector investment. At present, there are only three industries which are fully or partially reserved for the central government. A. Nuclear energy. At present, the central government is seriously considering the proposal of allowing the private sector to enter into the management of the nuclear power plants in the country. B. Nuclear research and related activities. The mining, use, management, fuel fabrication, export, import, waste management, etc. of radioactive minerals. None of the nuclear powers in the world have allowed the entry to private sector in these activities. Thus, no such attempts look logical in India too. See, railways. Many of the functions related to the railways have been allowed private entry, but still the private sector cannot enter the sector as a full-fledged railway service provider. Two, delicensing of the industries. The number of industries put under the compulsory provision of licensing were cut down to only 18. Presently, there are only six industries which carry the burden of compulsory licensing, such as aerospace and defense related electronics, gunpowder, industrial explosives and detonating fuse, dangerous chemicals, tobacco, cigarette and related products, alcoholic drinks, drugs, and pharmaceuticals. Abolition of the MRTP limit. The MRTP limit was rupees 100 crore so that the mergers, acquisitions, and takeovers of the industries could become possible. In 2002, a Competition Act was passed which has replaced the MRTP Act. In place of the MRTP Commission, the Competition Commission has started functioning. Promotion to foreign investment. The direct form of foreign investment was called as the foreign direct investment (FDI). Under the FDI, the MNCs were allowed to set up their firms in India in the different sectors varying from 26% to 100% ownership with them. The FDI started in the year 1991 itself. The indirect form of foreign investment in which the assets owned by the Indian firms in equity capital was called the Portfolio Investment Scheme (PIS) in the country, which formally commenced in 1994. Under the PIS, the foreign institutional investors (FIIs) having good track record are allowed to invest in the Indian security or stock market. The FIIs need to register themselves as a stock broker with the SEBI. It means India has not allowed individual foreign investment in the security market still, only institutional investment has been allowed till now. FERA replaced by FEMA. The government committed in 1991 to itself to replace the draconian FERA with a highly liberal Foreign Exchange Management Act FEMA. FEMA was into effected in the year 2000 to 2001 with a sunset clause of 2 years. Location of industries. Related provisions were simplified by the policy, which was highly cumbersome and a time consuming process. Now, the industries were classified into polluting and non polluting categories, and a highly simple provision deciding their location was announced. Non polluting, anywhere, polluting, at least 25 kilometers away from the cities having a million population. 7. Compulsion of phased production abolished. 8. Compulsion to convert the loans into shares abolished. The private companies who had borrowed capital from these banks now wanted their loans to be paid back. The government came with a novel provision for the companies who were unable to repay the loans. Most of them were like it, as they could opt to convert their loans amounts into equity shares and hand them over to the banks. Impact of the National Industrial Policy of 1991. Such a compulsion, which hampered the growth and development of the Indian industries, was withdrawn by the government in 1991. Any one idea, the New policy challenged was an emphatic goodbye to the control regime perpetuated till now by the government. The picture presented by the new industrial policy of 1991 was as a rolling back of the state. This is why experts have suggested that only assuming that reforms will benefit the masses will not be enough to make it happen politically. But the governments, the administrative agencies, and the economists all need to link it positively to mass welfare. This is why experts have suggested that only assuming that reforms will benefit the masses will not be enough to make it happen politically. But the government, the administrative agencies, and the economists all need to link it positively to mass welfare. In the coming times, the government went from one to another generations of the reforms, setting new targets and every time trying to make reforms socio-politically possible. Economic reforms of India 1991. Background of the economic reforms. India faced a severe balance of payment crisis in June 1991. Basically, in 1990 and 1991, there were several interconnected events which were growing unfavorably for the Indian economy. They were following: 1. The Gulf War, causing higher oil prices. 2. Sharp decline in the private remittances from the overseas Indian workers in the wake of the Gulf War. 3. Inflation peaking at nearly 17%. 4. The gross fiscal deficit of the central government reaching 8.4% of the GDP. 5. By the month of June 1991, India's foreign exchange had declined to just 2 weeks of import coverage. India's near miss to a serious balance of payment crisis was the proximate cause that started India's market liberalization measures in 1991, followed by a gradual approach of reforms. The initial phase of reforms focused on macroeconomic stabilization, while the reforms of industrial policy, trade and exchange rate policies, foreign investment policy, financial and tax reforms, as well as public sector reforms did also follow soon. The financial support India received from the IMF to came out the BOP crisis of 1990-91 were having a tag of conditions to be fulfilled by India. The IMF conditions put forth for India were as under: devaluation of the rupee by 22%, drastic reduction in the peak import tariff from the prevailing level of 130% to 30%, excise duties to be hiked by 20% to neutralize the revenue shortfalls due to the custom cut, for all government expenditure to be cut down by 10% annually. Though India was able to pay back its IMF dues in time, the structural reform of the economy was launched to fulfill the above given conditions of the IMF. The process of economic reforms in India had to face severe criticism from almost every quarter of the economy concerned, although the reforms were aimed to boost growth and deliver competitiveness to the economy. As the nature and scope of the economy were molded by the various industrial policies India did follow till date, any desired change in the economic structure had to be induced with the help of another industrial policy. Reform measures. The economic reform program that India launched, consisting of two categories of measures: 1. Macroeconomic stabilization measures; 2. Structural reform measures. The LPG reforms. The process of reforms in India was mainly focused on three processes, popularly known as their short form LPG, namely liberalization, privatization, globalization. These three processes clearly showcases the characteristics of the reform process initiated in India. Precisely seen, liberalization shows the direction of reform, privatization shows the path of reform, and globalization shows the ultimate goal of the reform. Liberalization. The term liberalization originates from the political ideology liberalism, which took its form by the early 19th century. The ideology of liberalization was the result of the breakdown of feudalism and the growth of a market or capitalist society in place of feudalism. It became popularized by the writings of Adam Smith, its founding father in the USA, and got identified as a principle of laissez-faire. Pro-market or pro-capitalistic inclination in the economic policies of an economy is the process of liberalization. We see it taking place in the whole Euro-America in the 1970s and particularly in the 1980s. The most suitable example of this process could be China of the mid-1980s when it announced its open door policy. Though China lacks even today some trademark traits of liberalism, as for example individualism, liberty, democratic system, etc., still China was called a liberalizing economy. The liberalization means that the process of decreasing traits of a state economy and increasing traits of a market economy. In the Indian case, the term liberalization is used to show the direction of the economic reforms with decreasing influence of the state or the planned or the command economy and increasing influence of the free market or the capitalistic economy. Privatization. The decades of the 1980s and the 1990s witnessed a rolling back of the state by the governments, especially in the USA and UK, under the inspiration of new right priorities and beliefs. Privatization at that time was used as a process under which the state assets were transferred to the private sector. But during the period, several connotations and meanings of the term privatization have developed. We may see them as follows: denationalization, disinvestment, deregulation, delicensing, subsidy reduction, foreign investment, etc. Denationalization. Privatization means the transfer of the state ownership of the assets to the private sector to the tune of 100%. Such bold moves took place only once anywhere in the world without any political fallouts in the early 1980s of the UK under the Thatcher regime. This route of privatization has been avoided by almost all democratic systems. In the mid 1990s, some West European nations like Italy, Spain, and France, besides the USA, went for such moves. India never ventured it into any such privatization move. Disinvestment. The sense in which privatization has been used is the process of disinvestment all over the world. Selling of the shares of the state owned enterprises to the private sector. Only 49% ownership remains with the state and 51% ownership to the private sector. Expansion of private sector or market. The third and the last sense in which the term privatization has been used around the world is very wide. Globalization. Globalization is considered as a process that leads to an increase in economic integration among nations. Even before the birth, several nation states, the countries around the world, had gone for globalization, that is, a close integration of their economies. This globalization lasted from 1800 to almost 1930, interrupted by the Great Depression and the two wars, which led to the retrenchment and several trade barriers were erected since the early 1930s. After the wars during the mid 1980s, the concept of globalization was popularized by Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development (OECD). After the summit of the OECD, proposals for replacing the GATT by the WTO were pushed by the developed countries. It is better known as the starting of the Uruguay round of GATT deliberations, which ends in the Marrakesh 1994 with the birth of World Trade Organization. In the meantime, the OECD has defined 1995 globalization officially too, a shift from a world of distinct national economies to a global economy in which production is internationalized and financial capital flows freely and instantly between countries. The official meaning of the globalization for the WTO is movement of the economies of the world towards unrestricted cross-border movements of goods and services, capital, and the labor force. India became one of the founding members of the WTO and was obliged to promote the process of globalization. However, its economic reforms started with no such obligation. It is a different thing that India started the process of globalization right after the reforms were started in 1991 itself. Generations of economic reforms. Introduction. Though there were no such announcements or proposals while India launched its reforms in 1991, in the coming times, many generations of reforms were announced by the governments. A total of three generations of reforms have been announced to the present date, while experts have gone to suggest the fourth generation too. It can be substantiated the components of the various generations of reforms to properly understand the very characteristics and nature of the reform process in India. First generation reforms, 1991 to 2000. The ones which had been initiated in 1991 and end up to 2000 were called by the government as the reforms of the first generation. The broad coordinates of the first generation of reforms may be seen as under: promotion to private sector, 2. Public sector reforms, 3. External sector reforms, 4. Financial sector reforms, 5. Tax reforms. A major redirection was ensured by this generation of reforms in the economy. The command type of the economy moved strongly towards a market driven economy, and the private sector, domestic as well as foreign, envisaged having the greater participation in the future. Second generation reforms 2002 1 onwards. The major components were factor market reforms, dismantling of the administered price mechanism called APM, two, public sector reforms, now greater functional autonomy, three, reforms in government and public institutions, four, legal sector reforms, company law, etc., five, reforms in the critical areas. The second generation reforms also committed to suitably reforms in the infrastructure, agricultural extension, education and healthcare, etc. These areas have been called by the government as critical areas. Other than the above given focus of this generation of reforms, some other important areas were also emphasized during this generation of reforms. 1. States' role in the reform. 2. Fiscal consolidation. 3. Greater tax devolution to the states. 4. Focusing on the social sector. Third generation reforms, 2006 to 7 onwards. Announcement of the third generation of reforms was made on the margins of launching the 10th plan, 2002 to 2007. Fully functional Panchayati Raj institutions. This generation of reforms commits to the cause of Panchayati Raj institutions so that the benefits of economic reforms in general can reach to the grassroots. Though the constitutional arrangements for a decentralized developmental process were already effected in the early 1990s, it was in the early 2000s that the government gets convinced of the need for inclusive growth and development. Fourth generation reforms. This is not an official generation of reform in India. Basically, in early 2002, some experts coined this generation of reforms, which entail a fully information technology enabled India. They hypothesized two-way connection between the economic reforms and the information technology, with each one reinforcing the other. Disinvestment. Introduction. Disinvestment is a process of selling government equities in public sector enterprises. Disinvestment in India is seen connected to three major interrelated areas, namely 1. A tool of public sector reforms, 2. Complementary part of the de-reservation of the industries, 3. Initially motivated by the need to raise resources for the budgetary allocations. Disinvestment process in India. Reform. The new government, UPA, dismantled the Ministry of Disinvestment set up in 2001. From 27th May 2004, the Department of Disinvestment is one of the departments under the Ministry of Finance. The Department of Disinvestment has been renamed as Department of Investment and Public Asset Management (DPUM) from 14th April 2016. Objectives of DPUM: list of CPSEs on stock exchanges to promote people's ownership through public participation. 2. To improve efficiencies of the CPSEs through accountability to its shareholders. 3. To bring in operational efficiencies in the CPSEs through strategic investment, ensuring their greater contribution to economy. 4. Adopt a professional approach for financial management of CPSEs in the national interest and investment aimed at expanding public participation in ownership of CPSEs. Types of disinvestment. 1. Token disinvestment. Disinvestment started in India with a high political caution in a symbolic way known as the token disinvestment. General policy was to sell the shares of the PSUs maximum up to 49%. But in practice, shares were sold to the tune of 5 to 10% only. This phase of disinvestment, initially in 1991, though brought some extra funds to the government, which were used to fill up the fiscal deficit, considering the proceeds as the capital receipts. However, it could not initiate any new element to the PSUs, which could enhance their efficacy. It remained the major criticism of this type of disinvestment, and the experts around the world started suggesting the government to go for it in the way the ownership could be transferred from the government to the private sector. The other hot issue raised by the experts was related to the question of using the proceeds of disinvestment. Strategic disinvestment. In order to make the disinvestment a process by which the following purpose could be fulfilled: 1. Efficiency of the PSUs could be enhanced. Two, the government could deburden itself. So it has two categories, one strategic and two non-strategic. The government announced that it will generally reduce its stake shareholding in the non-strategic public sector enterprises PSEs to 26% or below if necessary. And in the strategic PSEs, it will retain its majority holding. The essence of the strategic disinvestment was the following. The minimum shares to be disinvestment will be 51%. The wholesale sale of shares will be done to a strategic partner. This form of disinvestment commenced with the Modern Food Industries Limited MFIL. The new government at the center did put this policy of strategic disinvestment on the hold practically and came up with a new policy in place. Current disinvestment policy. It has two major features, ideology behind the policy and the policy itself. The ideology behind the policy is the following. Public ownership of the PSUs to be promoted as they are wealth of nation. Two, government to hold minimum 51% shares in case of minority stake sale. And three, up to 50% or more shares might be sold off under the strategic disinvestment. The current policy of disinvestment followed by the government is as given below. Minority stake sale. The policy of November 2009 continues. Listed PSUs to be taken first to comply to minimum 25% norm. New PSUs to be listed. Follow on the public offers. DPEM to identify the PSUs and suggest the disinvestment in consultation with respective ministries. 2. Strategic disinvestment announced in February 2016 to be done through consultation among ministries, departments, and Niti Aayog. Niti Aayog to identify PSUs and advise on its different aspects, and core group of secretaries on disinvestment to consider the recommendations of Niti Aayog to facilitate a decision by CCAA, Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs, and to supervise, monitor the implementation process. The disinvestment policy is today seen as a part of government's comprehensive management of its investment in the PSUs. Under this, the government considers its investment in PSUs as an important asset for accelerating economic growth. Moreover, it is committed to their efficient use to achieve optimum return through the following measures: leveraging of assets, capital, and financial restructuring, raising fresh investments by improving investors' confidence, and efficient management through rationalization of decision-making process. National Investment Fund 2005. Government had constituted the National Investment Fund in November 2005. The proceeds from the disinvestment of central public sector enterprises were to be channelized in the National Investment Fund. The corpus of the NIF was to be of a permanent nature. NIF was aimed to be professionally managed to provide sustainable returns to the government without depleting the corpus. Selected public sector mutual funds were entrusted with the management of the NIF corpus. As per this scheme, 75% of the annual income of the NIF was to be used for financing selected social sector schemes. The residual 25% of the annual income of NIF was to be used to meet the capital investment requirements of the profitable and the revivable PSUs. This one was kept outside the Consolidated Fund of India.